Today's daf is daf Samach, and we'll begin with Nasan Shemen al Shireho, which is one, two, three, four, five lines down from the top. So you may recall from yesterday's daf that there's an Iser and a Psul if you put a Shemen or Levona on top of a Minchas Chote, a separate lav in the Torah, and if you do so, it passes the korban. Torah Rabbanon, lo yosim oleh shemen v'lo yiten. Now, let's understand that the Iser is to put the shemen or the levona on top of the mincha itself. But after the kmitza, what you're left with is the shirayim. And the Mishnah points out that there's no prohibition about putting shemen or levona on the shirayim. The Iser is only when you put it on the mincha before the before the kmitza. And now the brisa is darshaning a pasuk lo yosim oleh shemen v'lo yiten. So the Torah prohibits you from putting either shemen, and then it says in the end of the pasuk lo yiten levona on top of the minchas chote. Yochol b'shnei kohanim. The brisa wants to suggest a havamina, which is going to be rejected, that maybe if one person, one kohen, let's say, would do this double avera and put both shemen and levona, then he would only get one set of malchus. And under what circumstances do we have a double violation with two sets of malchus? Lo yasim oleh shemen and then lo yitein oleh levona. That's only b'shnei kohanim. So Ruvain, the first kohen, he's the one who violated the Isur by putting shemen on the minchas chote, and then Shimon, the second kohen, violated this avera by putting levona on the minchas chote. But if, let's say, Ruvain did both, then he would only get one set of malchus. When it's Ruvain doing the shemen and Shimon doing the levona, then Ruvain will get one set of malchus for violating lo yosim oleh shemen, and then Shimon will get a set of malchus for violating lo yiten oleh levona. Talmud Lama, this is not so, because it says oleha. And what does oleha teach us? That the whole emphasis here on the lav, on the violation, on the avera, is oleha. It's on the gufa shel mincha. Now, as far as the gufa shel mincha is concerned, there's like a psul. It's almost like, if I could use figurative language, like the mincha is insulted by the fact that you added shemen or levona. And with regard to the insult to the mincha, it makes no difference whether it's one kohen or another kohen. In brisket jargon, we would say it's a din in the cheft of the mincha. Has nothing to do with the gavra, the kohen. Therefore, if each kohen individually violates the sensitivity of the korban minchas chote by either putting on shemen or by putting on levona, he would get one set of malchus for putting on shemen, another set of malchus for putting on levona, and all told, he's going to get two sets of malchus, and that's v'lo b'kohen. In other words, the emphasis here is not on the kohen. If it was on the kohen, then we would say that when it says lo yasim, etc., it's referring to one kohen who does both, and he puts both shemen and levona on top of the mincha. Now, all this is according to Rashi's pshat. Tosfos is going to learn that there was never really a havamina that one kohen could not incur two sets of malchus because the pasuk formulates two different losas, one lav with regard to shemen, another lav with regard to levona. So clearly, for each violation, there's a chi of malchus, and we have many examples of one person getting two sets of malchus. But rather, the issue that the brisa was addressing was where you have two different menachos, and you did one violation with regard to one mincha and another violation with regard to the second mincha. So, for example, let's say there was shemen placed on top of one mincha, and then there was Levona on the other mincha. And although the Brisa uses the word Yochel b'shnei Kohanim, Tosfos figures out how to, reinterpret that Brisa. And the two Kohanim is not referring to a case of two Kohanim, but two Menachos. And perhaps, says the Brisa, the violation of Shemen or Levona to a Minchas Chote only applies when he adds it to a Mincha Kshera, meaning if there's only one Mincha and then he added Shemen and then Levona, well, the very split second that he added the Shemen, as we discussed in yesterday's daf, the Mincha becomes Psula. And now when you add the Levona, you don't violate any Iser of adding Levona because the Mincha is Psula. It's like you didn't do anything, you didn't accomplish anything. So therefore, in the Havamin of the Brisa, if not for the Pasuk or Leah, you would have thought that the only possibility of incurring two sets of Malchus would be if the Kohen added Shemen to one Mincha, and then he has a second Mincha, which is a Mincha Kshera, and then he added the Levona to the second Mincha. Now, Kamashmalon, the Brisa now quotes the word Oleha that teaches us that even if the Levona was placed on the very same Oleha, the very same Mincha that received the oil, the Shemen, he's going to be in violation of both Averos, and he'd get two sets of Malchus, despite the fact that the carbon was already Nifsal with the addition of the Shemen. However, Tosfos says that Rabbeinu Tam is not at all happy about this, and he actually holds that he's only liable for the Levona if it was placed on a Mincha that was Kshera and had no oil on it. Now we get to the Chatzitza business. The Mishnah says, the Brisa continues and says, Yochel lo yitain kli al gabe kli. Would he violate an Avera if he had a kli of Shemen, and underneath it he has the kli of the Mincha that's holding on to the fine flour, and now he puts one kli on top of the other, or the same in Levona. And v'imnosam pasal, and therefore in the Havamina that we think he violates this, then he pasels the Mincha. Talmud Lomar Oleha, the Gufa shel Mincha kos medaber. The Torah is prohibiting you from putting the oil or the Levona directly on the goof of the Mincha, but not with the Chatzitza of a Kli in between. Okay, now we start the daf, pretty much the daf for today. All that we did was now, up until now, was just to complete yesterday's daf. Okay, now the subject of this Mishnah is what's called Hagosha. And it's strange because we really don't know all the details of how the Hagosha is done. And, to explain, so to speak, logically why the Torah requires this whole Hagosha business. But let's just say, as a starter, that the Hagosha requires that you take the Mincha and you bring it into contact with part of the Mizbeach. And as we know, the Mizbeach is divided into four different corners. And the Hagosha requires that you bring the Mincha. Again, this halach of Hagosha might apply even beyond Menachos, but right now we're learning the laws of Menachos, and we're going to have to bring the Mincha near the Mizbeach. It's I wish I could give you a mashal. It's like like in certain games that the children play, they have to touch they have to touch a certain base. You know what I mean? Like who gets there first or who touches it or they get safety if they're touching it. It's kind of like an act of kavod, of honor for the mincha that you did this hagasha. And there was a contact with like, the mizbeach. Then there's another thing which is called tnufa, which is waving. So the subject of this Mishnah. Oh yeah, now I told you that there were four corners to the Mizbeach. We're talking about what's called the Dromis Maravis. Okay, that will again, this is all coming up later, much later on, not in today's stuff. But anyway, there's the Keren Dromis Maravis, the southwestern corner of the Mizbeach. Why that particular part of the Mizbeach is singled out, I don't know. But actually, we're not going to see it so much here in Menachos. It's really back in Zvachim on Daf Samach Gimel and Zvachim. But anyway, so then the Mishnah says the following. And it's very similar in structure to the previous Mishnah that we learned. Yesh tu'unos hagasha, v'ein tu'unos tnufa, hagasha utnufa, tnufa v'lo hagasha, lo tnufa v'lo hagasha. So once again, we're dividing up the Menachos into four categories as to whether or not you require hagasha and tnufa. And v'elu to unos hagasha v'ein to unos tnufa. So now we have a list of 10 menachos that require hagasha, but do not require tnufa. And that's the only category of the four categories that we'll be discussing in this Mishnah for today's daf. And we're familiar with this list of 10. We had it already back in the previous Mishnah. There's minchas soles, which is the voluntary mincha that a person brings. And that's going to require hagasha. Then you have the machvas, the marcheches, the chalos, right? The chalos, in a case of a person who voluntarily took upon himself a minchas mafeh, and the minchas mafeh subdivides into two categories, either chalos or rikikos, rikikin. We'll see Reb Shimon adds a third possibility where you have half and half. Then we have the minchas kohanim, which is the mincha that was voluntarily accepted upon himself by a kohen. Minchas kohen Mashiach, now we're talking about the chavitin of the kohen gadol that has to be brought every day. And then finally, minchas nachrim or minchas nashim, if a guy brings a mincha or a woman brings a mincha. And last but not least, number 10 on the list is minchas chote. And chote is what's called a carbon olive yored, which means that certain averos, if you commit them b'shogeg, like for example, if you come into the Migdash Bituma, so then the actual carbon that you have to bring will reflect itself in your financial status. So that, for example, if you can afford it, you'll bring an animal for a carbon to be mechaper on the shogeg. If you're poor, the lowest level, well, if you're poor, you could bring birds, but the lowest level of poverty, which is called Dali Dalus, those people will bring a mincha. That's the cheapest of all. So that's called a minchas chote. The Gemara later on is going to discuss whether minchas chote is something that's frequent or it's very rare. Anyway, Reb Shimon Omer, he's going to add a number 11 to the list, and that's minchas. I'm sorry, that's Rav Papa is going to quote a different Reb Shimon, but Reb Shimon in our Mishnah, minchas kohen Mashiach, ein bahem hagasha. So we had in our list of 10 menachos for hagasha, we had minchas kohanim, and we had minchas kohen Mashiach, the chavit and the kohen, and Rabbi Shimon denies it, ein bahem hagasha. Now, what's the logic of Rabbi Shimon? Rabbi Shimon holds that what generates hagasha, it's the kmitza. According to Rabbi Shimon's ruling, if there's no kmitza, then by definition there's no agosha. And these two menachos, which are totally burnt on the mizbeach, because the whole purpose of kmitza is to be matir the shirayim for achilas kohen. But in these two cases of minchas kohen and minchas kohen Mashiach, the entire korban, the whole mincha, is burnt on the mizbeach, and there's no kmitza. And Reb Shimon holds if there's no kmitza, then there's no hagosha, meaning kmitza and hagosha go together, hand in hand. So if you have a mincha without kmitza, and here we have two examples of menachos that are completely burnt on the mizbeach without kmitza, because kmitza means that only the komets will be burnt on the mizbeach, but not the remainder. Is then, according to Reb Shimon, there's no hagosha. So all told, Reb Shimon would have 12 different. Just 1 second. I'm sorry, Reb Shimon would have 8 different menachos that require hagosha instead of 10. Omer Papa kol heichad Tanan eser Tanan. Reb Papa wants to know that whenever you have a list in any Mishnah of menachos, it'll always come to the number 10. And that we have one example right here with regard to the menachos that require hagosha but don't require tnufa. Maika mashma, why does Reb Papa have to tell me this? I mean, I could count it up on my own. Reb Shimon di Omar, and this is another Reb Shimon, not another statement of the same Reb Shimon, but mechza chalos mechza rikikin yava. If a person takes upon himself a nedava to bring a minchas mafer, then he can actually bring 5 of the 10 loaves as chalos, meaning matzos, and 5 as rikikin. And therefore, according to Reb Shimon, we'd add an 11th category of menachos, which again would apply the principle that they don't have any chiyuv of tnufa, they only have a chiyuv of hagosha. Kavash malandalo. So Papa wants to tell us that our Mishnah is against Reb Shimon because our Mishnah only counts 10. Hani mili. So for the balance of the shir today, of the daf today, we're going to learn about various yalfusos. And the first one that we're going to derive is hagosha, meaning that's the subject of our Mishnah, the menachos that require hagosha, but they don't require tnufa. The Tana Rabbana we learned in a brisa. Now, this brisa begins with a meticulous analysis of a pasuk that's critical for our whole investigation today. And the pasuk is at the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. And I'm going to read the pasuk, but take a look at the ilu nemar in the brisa, and you'll see a change here. The pasuk itself says, "Va'avesa es hamincha asher ye'aseh me'el el Hashem v'kriva el hakohen v'gisha el hamizbeach." So, if argues the brisa, it would have said in the pasuk, "Va'avesa asher ye'aseh me'el el Hashem," and simply v'kriva el hakohen v'gisha, and simply omitted the 2 words of Asher Ye'aseh, then Hayisi Omer, I would come to the conclusion, Ein li sheton agosha el kometz bilvad. Meaning, there are 2 stages in the bringing of the mincha. There's the preparation of the mincha in a klishares, etc., etc., and then you do the kmitza. The Kohen does the kmitza, and at what point does he? No. Yeah, that's also true. So let me say it that way, and then I'll clarify. At what point does the hagosha have to be fulfilled? Is it the entire mincha, meaning before you did the kmitza, or only on the komets itself. That requires hagosha. Because keep in mind, after the kmitza, the rest, the shirayim, is eaten by the kohen. So it has really no connection to the mizbeach. The only thing that has connection to the mizbeach really is the kmitza. But now we're learning from the extra two words in the pasuk, right? It says es hamincha, and that's going to teach me that the mincha in its complete form before kmitza requires hagosha. Talmud lomar mincha, and the extra word mincha, which is superfluous, is going to teach me that even when the mincha is still complete and you haven't even separated the komets, nevertheless, you've got to do hagosha. Okay, that's the kickoff, so to speak. But that's not really what we're going to be focusing our attention on today. Minchas chote minayin. Okay, now in the list of Hagosha, of those menachos that require Hagosha, the last one on the list is Minchas chote. And it's very interesting that the Brisa is assuming that since we're starting with the pasuk Ve'veses HaMincha, and it says Asher Yaseh Me'ele, that was the pasuk we just read at the beginning of Vayikra, that equates, all the menachos that are voluntary, like for example, Minchas Machvas, Minchas Maseches, because it says Asher Yaseh Me'ele, amongst all the menachos. However, what's common to all these menachos that require agosha is that they are nidavos, they are voluntary menachos. The exception to the rule is the last case on the list, and that's the minchas chote, because once he's in violation of those chatoim, like we mentioned before, he went into the Mikdash Tameh, then he's required to bring a minchas uh, chote. Now, the truth be told, that Minchas Kohen Mashiach, the Chavitin, really doesn't fit the description that we gave. So I'm not sure exactly where to put in Minchas Kohen Mashiach here in the context. So we'll leave that as a question. But assuming theoretically, which is not correct, that Minchas Kohen Chote would also be voluntary, then 9 out of the 10 on the list are voluntary, and the 10th on the list, Minchas Chote, is an absolute requirement. Not only that, but the Minchas Chote, as we learned in the previous Mishnah, doesn't require Shemen or Levona. That also puts it into a separate category. And it's Kuli Kolil, right? There's no Kmitza. So we need, at this point in the Brisa, although the Brisa is going to question this premise, we need a pasuk to teach me that even a Minchas Chote, despite the fact that it's so unique and so different than all the other Menachos, and it's a Minchas Chova, it still requires Hagosha. Bidinu. So now the Brisa itself raises the fine question. Why do I need a pasuk es hamincha to include a minchas chote in the requirement of Hagosha? Vidinu, I could derive it from logic. Okay. Now, I just want to apologize. We really need a whiteboard for this. There's so many different types of menachos with so many different variations. I did receive in the WhatsApp from my son a chart for yesterday's shir. So if you want, I'll forward it to you. Just remind me. Nemar Have. One second. Okay, Nemar Have